Welcome to Interviews from Quito. My name is Gregory Wilpert, and today I'm joined by Eirik Vold, who's a freelance journalist who has worked with a number of different news outlets in Europe and in Latin America, such as Le Monde Diplomatique and Radio France International. And recently he's been doing some investigations on the role of NATO, particularly since he's Norwegian and they have a Secretary General who's from Norway. And we'll also be talking a bit about his investigations of Wikileaks. So thank you very much for joining us today, Eirik.
Thanks for having me, Greg. It's good to be here again.
So let's start with the first issue, which you've been looking into a lot recently, which is the fact that Norway is presenting the Secretary General of NATO, and it's kind of perhaps a little bit surprising considering that the Scandinavian countries have long been thought of as being very peace-oriented countries. And not only that, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, has a history of being a leftist activist, or starting out his biography that way, then becoming Labour's president of the Labour Party in Norway, and now as Secretary General. Tell us a little bit about how that happened and how this transformation of Stoltenberg took place.
Yeah, he's definitely a kind of curious political phenomenon. He started out, as you mentioned, as a leftist activist. He was very young. He became a leader of the Labour Party youth movement, and he argued one of the main cases that he was famous for was his resistance or his activism against the military coup in Chile, against the Pinochet dictatorship, and in favor of the deposed and murdered elected leader Salvador Allende. After that, he reportedly, at some point, even supported the Sandinista movement in Nicaragua. And more importantly, he also officially, as a Labour youth leader, argued for the pulling out of NATO. He wanted Norway to pull out of NATO. And that's curious, because that was during the Cold War, when you could argue that NATO actually did have a sort of defensive function for a tiny country like Norway with a border against the Soviet Union. So at that point, he wanted Norway to pull out of NATO. But then afterwards, after the Cold War, now that NATO has clearly assumed a much more aggressive, even formally embraced this out-of-area doctrine of bombing third world countries. Now he's not only in favor of staying in NATO, but he also became the head of the NATO. So it's definitely a curious phenomenon. I mean, I should add that he's been a very successful politician. He has been the 3 times Prime Minister of Norway, and during 2 of his governments, Norway, at least his government, called itself the most leftist government of Europe. And his social and economic policies were deemed progressive and very successful, actually, in terms of social and economic outcome for the Norwegian people.
So how is it, though, that somebody who represents a leftist government becomes Secretary General of what has turned into a fairly war-active organization in the world? Why would somebody like that become Secretary General of NATO?
Well, cynics would say that the defining point was when Norway joined the war against Libya. Many people don't know this outside Norway, but actually during the first phase of the bombing of Libya, Norway was the one country that dropped most bombs. More than the US, more than England, more than France, more than everyone. And apart from that, we also attacked the most sensitive targets, because there were targets, for instance in Tripoli, in the capital, in very densely populated areas that other NATO members with a lot more experience in war, they wouldn't accept those targets because of the high probability of killing civilians and injuring civilians, and because they were also probably illegal. They were way outside the mandate of the UN Security Council resolution. But Norway did attack those targets and probably killed a significant number of civilians. And I think that showed the Norwegian loyalty to the NATO in a way that opened up the way for Stoltenberg to become the Secretary General of NATO. Also, it's important to remember that obviously he has his personal skills as a politician that are unquestionable. He's a very charming, charismatic politician, and he's good in dealing with people, convincing people. And you have to take into account that the Norwegian government alliance at that time also contained a party called the Socialist Left-Wing Party. That party was founded almost exclusively in order to get Norway out of NATO. And he managed to convince them to not only stay within the NATO alliance, but also to pull the trigger, to push the button and order these Norwegian bomb attacks over Tripoli. And that's quite impressive because this is probably, as you mentioned, Norway has a very peaceful tradition. And the Libya war was probably the most aggressive act of war that Norway has committed since the Viking era about 1,000 years ago. So when you manage to get a party like the Social Leftist Party to join that and to applaud that war, at least the initial phase of it, you have to admit that you have some convincing skills. And there's another factor, of course, which you also mentioned, which is the fact that Norway has an image as a peaceful country. We award the Nobel Peace Prize. We have headed several peace processes, some of them successful, others not so successful. Right now, Norway is very much involved in the Colombian peace process. There was a less successful attempt in Sri Lanka, and the Oslo Accord in Palestine. Exactly. But so we have this image. So by naming a Norwegian Secretary General of NATO, you give a hawkish policy a very dovish face. You give a peaceful, even leftist kind of face to NATO, just in a face of NATO's activities when we're moving from a defensive to a very offensive alliance.
So how do you explain, though, that Norway makes such a turnabout and joins the bombing campaign against Libya? If it has, I understand that it has this image, and perhaps that's why other countries would want to push for its participation. But it involved the government of Norway. Why would the government of Norway want to change its and perhaps damage its image in the process?
Exactly. So I already explained why the US would want a Norwegian face to front NATO. Now, your question is, how did this turnaround happen in Norwegian politics? I think that's part of a bigger trend. I think it has to do with it's a late effect of a change that happened in the US when some of the strategists found out that in order to we already have the support of the right for war, and in order to get uniform support from the left as well and the center of politics, we have to give war a new image. And that's when humanitarian intervention arises. And that actually worked out quite well. I think that there has been a tremendous shift in social democratic and leftist and liberal circles in the US, in Europe, and also now it's reached Norway. It's a little bit more surprising with Norway, maybe because of all this peace image. But I think another reason was that, for instance, there was a huge resistance. One of the biggest demonstrations that has taken place in Norway in its post-World War II history was the protests against George Bush's war against Iraq. Now, George Bush is out, and then comes Obama, and there was a tremendous shift because, and I think it boils down to something very simple. Identity politics. Obama is Afro-American. He represents a formerly oppressed minority. He talks in liberal terms, and he sort of at least carries out some limited measures to benefit ordinary Americans, poor Americans. You have this health insurance reform that he carried out, and all that changed the whole attitude towards the U.S. in Norway. The liberal elite of Norway that derided, that attacked Bush harshly in the press, turned around completely, and it seems to apply completely different criteria when it's judging Obama's policies. So that's part of it, and I think that's what we're going to see a lot more of that, because I'm pretty sure that Hillary Clinton is going to be the next president. And she can pretty much do whatever she wants. She can carry out the same aggressive foreign policy, the same hawkish foreign policy as George Bush did, but he will get a lot less criticism because she's a strong woman. She's the feminist. It's a strong woman for, pro-gay rights and liberal values against the conservative white man like Putin or whatever, and that actually does a lot to convince liberal elites of Europe.
But I mean, that's one of the interesting things is also the way, like you were saying, NATO has been completely refunctionalized in terms of what its function is. It was originally supposed to be a mutual defense agreement in case any of its member countries is attacked, they would each defend each other. But now, with its actions in former Yugoslavia and then in Libya and other places around the world, that's completely gone out of the window. So there's been a real transformation within NATO. Is there something that you could say about that? How that happened on a larger perspective?
Yeah, that's a lot of history and a lot of geopolitics. I think it's the way that the U.S. wants. First of all, it's better for the U.S. to have European countries carry out their warfare and to sort of have a backing, an international backing, not go it alone like they did in the Iraq War. That made Bush very unpopular, and it made the U.S. very unpopular. And having NATO that at least represents a lot of Western democracies, many of them social democratic, it gives a different image. So I think that's the main reason. Because I think, or else apart from that, it's simply the fact that the U.S. has a big capacity when it comes to military superiority, whereas they're fading in terms of economic and industrial capacity. So it's the way to keep a war machine going. That's NATO, and that's NATO's out-of-area strategy. There is another subject that I want to touch upon, and that is the fact that in the best of cases, Stoltenberg comes from the new Secretary General of NATO. He comes from a sort of the closest you get to an aristocratic family in Norway. His father was a Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he dealt a lot with the Russians, with the Soviets or the Russians, and also with the Serbs in Yugoslavia. And Norway, as a country that borders to Russia, has a lot of experience when it comes to dealing with the Russians. Even when Stoltenberg was the Prime Minister, his foreign minister even wrote an article together with Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia. So the Norwegians has a lot of experience in dealing with the Russians, and I think that can come in handy for NATO, either independently of what sort of policy we are going to carry out against the Russian, whether we continue confrontation or we at some point changes the approach and starts to have a more peaceful approach to the Russians. Either way, the Norwegians could provide some good skills in dealing with the Russians for them.
So NATO, though, is involved in a kind of a confrontation course with Russia, especially with its policy towards Syria. What does that mean, though, for Norway? Isn't it getting into hot water with Russia as a result, and also Europe as a whole?
Definitely. If you look at Norway as a country, it's a tiny country of less than 5 million inhabitants. It's definitely not in Norway's interest to have a confrontation with Russia. And it's very, very obvious that the current Norwegian policies towards Russia is not something that fits Norway's national interest at all. It's a policy that comes out of Washington. I mean, we're taking on huge economic losses, especially in Norwegian fishery industries, taking huge losses. And I think that goes for most of Europe. European business, European exports, they're taking huge losses for a policy that very few people, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, very few politicians and leaders of Europe actually feel threatened by Russia as of today. I mean, the Russian approach has been, you could say that they've been sort of aggressive in their own backyard of Eastern Europe at some points, but it doesn't mean a threat at all to Western Europe. And we're taking a huge economic loss from these policies, and we're also risking to lose a very constructive cooperation that Norway had with the Russians in the northern areas, the Arctic. So yeah, this is definitely a dangerous path we're going along now. And what is also curious is that the left is the one that is the least on the ball. The left is not really presenting an alternative approach to this, because the left is so much dominated by identity politics. So they will say, well, yeah, Putin he's against the Muslims, or he's anti-feminist, he's conservative, whatever. And those would be valid arguments within the Norwegian left. So the only ones who have a sort of a geopolitical or realist approach is in those countries, in Scandinavian countries, are the business elite. You can see some people from the business elite will come out every now and then and say, hey, we're losing money, and this is Washington's project. We have nothing to do with this. We're losing money, and we're putting our own security at risk by confronting the Russians. But you won't see this coming from the left, and I think that's has some of the same explanations as the fact that Norway was willing to commit this very aggressive act of war against Libya, because the left is so much dominated by identity politics, and they believe in this liberal humanitarian interventionist doctrine.
Shifting gears a bit. The U.S. involvement in NATO, but then there's also the U.S. involvement in Latin America, and that's something else that you've looked at, looking at the WikiLeaks Cablegate cables. And one of the issues that's recently come up, and I was wondering if you could maybe comment on that, one of the issues that's recently come up in the news is the way that the U.S. has tried to torpedo the election observation mission of UNASUR by trying to get the Brazilians and the Uruguayans to withdraw. And recently also the Secretary General of the Organization of American States has criticized the Electoral Council of Venezuela very harshly about its policies. You seem to have discovered some more information in terms of the background of the U.S. intervening in trying to create obstacles for the integration effort. So what is behind that? What's going back further in history? What has happened in that regard?
Yeah, well, I mean, the current electoral campaign in Venezuela is, of course, after the time of the Cablegate documents. Those documents ended in 2011 mostly. But there is a lot of evidence that provides background to understand this. For instance, one of the reasons why the U.S. is probably trying to torpedo the UNASUR electoral observation mission in Venezuela is because they're not happy with what UNASUR has done earlier in times of conflict in Latin America. One of the more clear examples was in Bolivia. There was a very violent separatist attempt, sort of coup attempt, from the extreme right of Bolivia around 2008, 2009. And the UNASUR stepped in very successfully. This was a very early phase of the UNASUR as an established organization in Latin America. And they stepped in and they basically made a report from those events that was a very realistic report in the terms that it placed blame where it was to be placed, not on a democratically elected government that tried to maintain the territorial integrity of the Bolivian state, but among the extreme right that used violence in order to separate from the rest of Bolivia, including massacring poor Bolivian, mostly indigenous farmers, campesinos. And so the cables show that the U.S. was very, very unhappy with that, with UNASUR's intervention. The rest of Latin America, of South America, was extremely happy. You had Bachelet, who really doesn't represent, at least her first government did not represent any left turn in Chilean politics. But even she recognized that this separatist attempt in Bolivia had something Pinochetista over it. She made reference to Pinochet, the brutal military dictator of Chile. And so Latin America, South America was very happy with UNASUR because the conflict was resolved. There was no more bloodshed. Bolivia's territorial integrity was preserved, and their democratically elected authorities kept on governing, which was the goal of UNASUR. But the U.S. was very unhappy because it made their allies in Bolivia look bad. So it's basically, I think it boils down to that. They're not happy with how UNASUR does not guarantee the outcome that the U.S. wishes in conflicts in Latin America.
So were there specific cables that dealt with, that expressed this unhappiness?
Yeah, there were. I mean, they were very much concerned that that this report would lead to persecution of those who carried out the massacres, and that they would become isolated. So the U.S. wasn't happy with that, and their sources in Bolivia, who were, if not the perpetrators, at least the allies of the perpetrators of those crimes that were committed, they were also very, very unhappy. So that's basically the reason. And if you look at the bigger picture, the background here, I think that what has happened, and I've mentioned this earlier, what has happened during the last decade, during the last 15 years in Latin America, is that the Latin American countries have united for the first time. There hasn't been, since the colonization 500 years ago, there hasn't been a moment where a Latin American government has been as united as they are, or as they have been during the last 10 years. And UNASUR is a big part of that. And that has really reduced the U.S. dominance over Latin America. I think it's also, to get the historical perspectives right here, I think it's also safe to say that during the last 100 years, this is the lowest point of U.S. influence in Latin America. So we're talking a huge historical shift here that really doesn't fit U.S. interests in Latin America, which are basically access to cheap raw materials and geopolitical dominance. There's also another interesting thing that has been revealed by Wikileaks, and that is that Latin America is now, there was a huge scandal about these torture flights when the CIA took illegal prisoners, and they took them out of the US and stopped in countries in Europe and Africa and Asia in order to have
extraordinary rendition.
Yes, exactly, in order to have them tortured. But the only region that didn't participate in those torture flights was Latin America. And it might seem anecdotic, but it really says something about the depth of the shift that has taken place, because Latin America used to be, during the 70s, during the 80s, parts of the 60s, this was really where the US or US allies used to torture the most in the world. And this used to be sort of the US backyard, just like the parts of Eastern Europe was Soviet Union's backyard, Kremlin's backyards. So there has been a huge shift, and what really matters for the US, what really worries the US, and this you can read this very clearly from loads of these documents that are published by WikiLeaks, is that Latin American governments are now, and even across the political spectrum, are united in a way that reduces the US influence or dominance over this continent.
Well, I think we've pretty much run out of time, but thanks again for joining us here in Quito, and I hope you have a good return back to your home. And thank you for joining us at Interviews from Quito. My guest was Eirik Vold, an independent journalist, and I hope you join us next time. Thank you.